Well, everyone, we had some fun, but all good things have to come to an end, and Bad Apologetics is over now. So no,
Well, I
I
thought
just
there was demand for season 2.
yeah, that's why I've invited James on just so we can talk about what we want to do going forward and like plan some things and have a catch up and stuff. So that is what we're gonna do today, basically. So it's not a 6-hour stream or anything, but it's just for fans of the show who because I keep getting comments and stuff on the old videos saying, like this has been really helpful, or when are you guys going to start again? So, I guess I wanted to put something out there to give people some ideas, and maybe people can also feed back into us about what they want to see as well. But yeah, before we start, we were just talking about what we're both up to at the minute. And do you want to talk a bit more about your PhD stuff and what's going on there for people?
Yeah, so I started my PhD about 6 months ago. I'm doing a doctorate in neuroscience at the University of Melbourne. And my particular project is focused on trying to understand representation of semantic concepts in the brain. So this is a bit of a tricky area to explain. I guess that's true for a lot of research projects. But so semantic knowledge is knowledge of like facts and things, right? And it relates to the meaning of words. So how we understand the meaning of nouns, verbs, and adjectives and stuff like that. And there's been a lot of different work on this in different, like in psychology and neuroscience and artificial intelligence and linguistics. And I'm kind of interested in the intersection of several of those fields, particularly trying to look at machine learning models of language. Some people may have heard of some of the more recent successful ones, like GPT-3, that made headlines, I think, about a year ago. So these models can construct very natural sounding sentences and perform reasonably well on certain tasks. But they work very differently to how humans process language. Basically, they work by having the entire internet fed to them and learning to predict the next word from, like, in a sentence, given the previous words. And that sort of works surprisingly well. But it's questionable how much how closely that process relates to what humans are doing. So I'm interested in trying to test some of these models against behavioral data and then neuroimaging data. So basically, there have been a few studies where people read texts or listen to audiobooks or something in an fMRI scanner and have their brain activity recorded. And there are ways you can analyze that data and sort of compare it to the activity of a machine learning model and see if they're representing the information in a similar way. So that's sort of the specific thing that I'm interested in doing. Ultimately, with an eye to trying to learn what we can from the machine learning models and maybe look at developing different versions of the models or new sort of theoretical insights as to how humans kind of represent information about the world and understand the meaning of words. And this actually has quite a lot of philosophical importance as well, at least indirectly, because philosophy of language is still a huge part of analytic philosophy. And the question of like semantics, like how words get meaning and how that relates to intentionality and other things, is important there. So there's there's already some crossover there. I think that there's opportunity for more interplay between philosophical and scientific work there. But anyway, that's kind of what I'm working on, and will be for another couple of years yet.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
interesting as well because,
sorry, go ahead.
I guess I view that question that you're working on from a philosophical point of view as like a subset of the hard problem, really, because it's kind of like, you come at words and stuff. You can look at grammar and syntax, and even from a from a kind of computer science point of view, dealing with the syntax of natural language is quite it's a difficult task, but it's quite an easy task compared to anything more substantial, like trying to create an actual AI or something that somehow thinks or represents things in some way. So it's like what you're doing in terms of research there. There is this philosophical question almost. I mean, maybe this isn't true to the research that you're doing, but it sounds like there's this philosophical question about, like how then from a particular physical arrangement of things, or even a not a physical arrangement, but you might an arrangement that's represented on a computer somehow between different nodes in a network, whatever. But how do you actually then create something that has like a meaningful representation of words, because words have meanings to us? Is that the kind of gap that you're trying to bridge?
Well, scientific investigations into semantics don't usually get into philosophical questions about like what meaning ultimately is. They're usually operationalized more concretely. So there are various ways of looking for statistical similarities in the representation of the representation of a computational model versus representation of, say, brain imaging data, or against behavioral data as well, which is what that survey that I posted on my channel a few months ago was about. Nathan was asking about this just before we started recording. That's about gathering information about how humans assess the similarity of simple sentences, and particularly novel sentences, which people haven't heard before. So that's the kind of thing that you'll do in a scientific approach to this, is try to construct models and test them against data. But you don't really need to ask like what fundamentally is meaning to do that, although I think it can be helpful. And in terms of, so that's where you sort of fade into the philosophical question. For that, I think that in order to get a full grasp of that, we would need a much more complete understanding of the human cognitive system. I think meaning is embedded in what you might call a cognitive architecture. So I don't think that there's, I mean, this in itself is a particular position, but I don't think there's like a particular module in your brain that just does the meaning part. I think it's embedded in lots of other, I mean, this is an increasingly common view. It's sometimes called embodied cognition and related to other things as well. So, the way we understand meaning is related to how we move, like motor function. It's related to perceptions. It's related to our emotional system. It's related to our goals, because that's how we learn those. We learn the concepts embedded in a social and emotional and affective environment, like internally and externally, I mean. So the idea of like trying to abstract meaning from that completely, I think, is a bit of a mistake. You
like
can
as a reified
parts
thing,
of it,
right?
yeah, that's right. So you can abstract aspects of it, like similarity relations and things, but to really get the full picture, I think essentially you would have to reconstruct a cognitive system completely. And that's not what I'm trying to do, or what really anyone's trying to do at this point. I think we will get to that stage,
but it's a part of
a long ways
that
off.
problem.
Yeah,
It's
we're
like
looking at parts of it. Yeah, because we're not going to be able to just jump straight to the end. I think we're only going to get there by gradually understanding the bits of it and putting them together in a more and more complex way, which will take, it's going to take time. But I guess this is also part of the reason why I'm more interested in, although I'm philosophically minded in the way I approach scientific questions, I'm more interested in scientific approaches, because I feel like often philosophy will just try to sort of jump to the end, so to speak, and think about things in a reified way.
You can't do it. Yeah.
What is meaning?
I found the essence.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe that's possible, but I'm just pretty skeptical about those approaches. I feel like we're only going to get there iteratively and by putting the pieces together slowly. And there probably isn't any. Yeah, if you're looking for some sort of true essence of something, it probably just, I doubt that there are such things.
I get the sense that like you could probably take that approach and convince yourself that you'd found the essence, but I have the impression that by taking the approach that you are doing, that in 100 years time or stuff, 100 years time or stuff, what the hell was that for a second? 100 years time or something, the like the evidence and building models off the back of that evidence and the findings that you're doing and other people are probably going to push out some of those current views of what the essence of meaning sort of is. And so I think it's just a bit not naive, but it is a bit too soon really to be like, well, science just can't answer these questions, when it looks actually relatively promising for fairly young sort of branches of study that are making quite a lot of progress into these questions, to be saying, well, let's just cut off study because kind of got to get a priori get the essence of.
It's interesting because I've never heard anyone claim that we should stop studying these things scientifically. However, some of the arguments that they give seem to imply that studying certain things is fruitless and futile. So it seems that does follow from certain positions. I'm also I just think that other positions that I'm aware of are not, like things like, say, dualism about the mind, or even panpsychism and things like that. I don't know how you turn any of those into a scientific or quasi-scientific progressive research program. I've never seen that. I don't think it's
be interesting if someone could somehow.
It could be done, I'd be all for it. It'd be very interesting, but I just have strong suspicion that that's not possible, precisely because these views are too inchoate and don't allow for sort of testability and sort of iterative progress in the way that science does. So, yeah, like has substance dualism advanced much since Descartes? Arguments for it have, but I don't know that the fundamental positions has made nearly as much progress as compared to how much progress we've made in a physicalist understanding of the mind, where we've made enormous amounts of progress. So the point there is that even if we don't have a definitive answer about the nature of the mind or certain questions, I would say that we should be devoting resources and cognitive efforts to approaching it through a broadly sort of scientific, materialistic, naturalist lens, and call that methodological naturalism if you like. And that's where I'm going to bet my money on us making ultimately finding the answers to these questions, or possibly finding that the questions don't have answers. But either way, I just don't see the progress coming from other approaches.
Yeah, I do think that's right, though. I guess my concern with the overall trying to sort of solve the hard problem of consciousness through empirical questioning is I just don't know if it can actually like be done in principle. Not that it couldn't be the case that consciousness is reducible to the physical, but there might be just like some kind of epistemic barrier to actually, you know, like putting together a theory in terms of empirical facts, and then it being like, now the aspect of why consciousness is the way it is just is explained or makes sense or something. There might be, you know, there might just be this fundamental issue I can't talk today. Methodically, methodistically, one of those words to going about doing it that way.
I mean, there are certainly people who argue that you can't in principle have say a naturalistic answer to qualia or like the hard problem of consciousness. I mean, I don't think there is any other answer to the problem. I think that at best, alternatives simply say that it cannot be natural, therefore it must be something else. But the something else is always either just taken as a primitive or just undefined, which I don't think is really an improvement. But the thing is that what was I going to say about that? Oh yeah, so I mean, partly it depends on how you conceptualize science. I think of science in a fairly broad way. Some people think of it in a narrow way, but often, I mean, even honestly, even you know, like esteemed philosophers, I still see this in articles sometimes. They talk about that. This comes up in terms of talking about like normativity or morality as well. They say things like, well, you're never going to find morality in a test tube and things like that. I'm like, look, what philosophy of science have you been reading where like looking in test tubes is what science is? Like that, that's not how science works. Like science is just as theoretical as it is empirical. And so if we think that philosophy is about theoretical investigation, then so is science, right? The one of the differences is that science relies on empirical investigation to essentially test theories, and there's an iterative relationship there that is, or at least many philosophers would say, doesn't exist in the same way in philosophy. I would actually say it should, but that's my particular view of how philosophy should run. But the point is that the fact that there's a lot of theory that you need to unpack concepts and so on, like that all happens in science as well. Like a good example is in biology, where there's a massive debate about the notion of gene and species, and there has been for a long time. And that's a theoretical question. It's a philosophical question in some sense, but it's also a theoretical question in biology. Same thing in linguistics and cognitive science about these issues of meaning and representation and computational theory of mind. They're discussed in philosophy, but they're also discussed in science. There's somewhat differences in emphases and so forth. But the point is, it's not like science is just collecting empirical facts.
Right.
Just if that's all you did, then you wouldn't be able to answer these questions. But there's a lot of theory to it as well. And so those kind of objections that is somehow outside the framework of what science could do, I'm quite suspicious of. There's further questions as well as to whether science has like a normative aspects to it, which I think that it does. So the idea that there's a distinction between scientific investigation and any sort of normative claim or normative investigation, I would disagree with that, because I think it's fairly clear that science does have normative standards, and can also investigate those in a self-critical way. Like disciplines can examine their own standards. But anyway,
I guess you do get
that's a further question.
And you do get bodies of sort of like it's sort of philosophy, but it isn't quite philosophy, you know, like the ethics of doing, you know, this line of experimentation or whatever. But it seems more kind of when people ask those questions in a kind of scientific discipline, it seems more a part of the discipline itself than it does, you know, like when a philosophy department is like, oh, let's just do ethics or whatever.
Yeah, well, most of the philosophy ofs, philosophy of biology, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of physics, just merge into the theoretical side of those disciplines. I don't see a clear separation there at all. I mean, a good example is, oh, it's right here, is this book, which I picked up for my PhD, the Routledge Handbook of Semantics. I would call this a science book because it's essentially a linguistics book. But the first couple of chapters are basically talking about internalism and externalism, which is basically philosophical issues, but from a slightly, like, the angle is a little bit different. But they're talking about Putman, and they're talking about Fodor, and they're talking about
and what do you imagine on Twin Earth, James? What do you conceive?
Well,
where do you conceive the meanings are?
I'm still thinking about that myself. There's a lot of interesting issues there, but the point that I want to make here is just that I don't see these sort of separations that other people talk about sometimes between philosophy and science. And so the idea that, coming back to what you were saying, the idea that there is some aspect of, say, consciousness or quality that science in principle cannot address, but maybe philosophy can, I'm very skeptical of. More plausible would be that humans cannot just kind of, like, cognitive limitations in humans mean that we can't answer that question. That are more like a foundational epistemic limitation. That I find more plausible. But I just think that, I mean, the proof is in the pudding. I don't think we've been trying for very long. Neuroscience as a discipline is only about 50 years old. The Society of Neuroscience was founded in 1970. Cognitive neuroscience is even more recent than that. Real scientific investigation into consciousness, like Francis Crick was one of the first to do this in like the 90s. It's really new. And so like fMRI imaging, it's only like 25, 30 years old. And it's still not very good. Like, we need way better imaging techniques to get more information, the sort of information we're going to need. So I think people are calling the race way too soon on these sort of points.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think having more philosophically informed scientists, especially people in departments and people that structure departments and choose the way they run stuff, is pretty important for the sciences, from what I see as well. Because more and more I seem to see people sort of doing interdisciplinary work where they're kind of questioning some of the maybe conventional assumptions of their discipline, or branching out into other things. And that's where it's actually useful to sort of have your foot halfway in some of the philosophical discussions that are going on there. So you're able to kind of synthesize some of those questions that arise when you try and do that. And that's why I think, you know, and it's good for people who are science communicators as well. Like one of the reasons why I think Sean Carroll's so great is because he can come on and talk about physics, but in a way that responds to some of the objections that the theoretical philosophers will sort of want to raise to some of the findings that maybe other physicists wouldn't be able to respond to, because they've just sort of neglected to think about the philosophical implications of their worldview. And so I think it's more, I think it is valuable for there to be, you know, more scientists who are like competent and familiarized with the latest kind of scientific research and theorizing, but also have a kind of robust philosophical understanding of how those things like fit into a systematic way of viewing what the science does and what its assumptions are, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I wanted to ask though about what you're doing, because I don't really have a clear idea. We just sort of started talking about this before.
I'm doing a master's in philosophy at the minute at Glasgow, and I think that was that decision was mostly because I was like, well, I really want to do philosophy. I really enjoy it, and if I don't do this academically at some point, I'm gonna regret it in some sense, or I'm gonna always sort of have that itch that I wish I scratched. But now that I've been doing it for 4 months or so, it feels a little bit undesirable to me in certain ways, because I've become a bit disillusioned with at least the way I see sort of academia to function, and the kind of questions that people are asking and stuff just don't seem that worthwhile to me for the amount of time and resource that seems to get spent on them. It seems like people's time would be better allocated doing other things. But so at the minute I'm just on a conventional taught master's, What did I do last semester? I did analytic philosophy, formal logic, and philosophy of language. Next semester, I'm doing analytic philosophy, Wittgenstein, and philosophy of religion, and then I'll do a dissertation and be finished.
Wait,
Sometime
Wittgenstein and philosophy, is that a
as
subject
in
or are those
separate
two
modules?
subjects?
Yeah,
Okay, right.
two subjects. Yeah,
I didn't
The
know that
same with
Wittgenstein
language.
said too much about philosophy of religion, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But yeah,
Well, he did actually say a lot. One of the interesting things about the Tractatus in his early philosophy is that he sort of, I think he sort of had I think he might have had borderline personality disorder, but I can't like make a diagnosis, obviously. And I think he also was pretty depressed. And in World War One, in the trenches, I think he went a little bit crazy and kind of, and he had Tolstoy's The Gospel in Brief, and he converted to Christianity. And so he had the first part of the Tractatus, and when he finished it off, I think it became like a mystical book. And I think that's what he legitimately viewed what he's doing, which is what makes it rather. There's like a kind of irony to the Vienna Circle taking the Tractatus and thinking, we're going to do away with all of metaphysics, and then Wittgenstein's kind of like, what the hell? Like, this is like a mystical, spiritual book. But yeah, it's a weird guy,
an odd one.
He did some research in medicine in World War II as well. On shock, where he did away with the term of shock as like being a confused term, and put an end to all these research programs that people were doing on shock, because when he wrote this thing with a bunch of other doctors that he was working with and put it forward to whoever it was, the British Medical Council or whatever, they read it and they were like, yeah, we're putting all this funding into all of these into all of this research, trying to like find the essence of shock, like what is it? Is it blood pressure? Is it this? Is it that? Off the back of research in World War One. And then they were like, yeah, it's actually just, we're just really confused and we're like running around in circles doing nothing. I think that's interesting how close that is to some of the stuff he was saying about philosophy. But yeah, so that's what I'm going to be doing next semester, and deciding on what I want to do my dissertation on, which I'm not sure as well. Like because sometimes I think maybe I should do it on something in philosophy of religion, but then other times I think maybe I should do it on something in logic, and I'd get more out of that, or more that would be transferable to whatever I'm going to do afterwards. But I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends what you're interested in. If you are interested in some of the sort of the nexus of sort of machine learning and statistics and philosophy of mind, also philosophy of language, there's plenty of things you could do in that could be interesting, including something about like qualia, if that was of interest. Like that would be something that if I had to pick a master's thesis, I'd probably pick something around that.
Yeah, I've thought about it. Another thing I thought was could be interesting, is a question. It is trying to question sort of like belief change, and what should prompt someone to what kind of at what point, or what kind of considerations should prompt someone to change a relatively foundational belief, like like a religious commitment, or like a belief about like a personal relationship or something like that. Because I think those I think those questions are they have like a lot of personal interest to me, in terms of things that have happened in my life, but are also quite interesting philosophically. Like I don't think a lot of people have really tried to touch on. Oh, just reading it, or get a real job. Thanks, Dave.
That notion of a real job, I think, is increasingly
pernicious and confused.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Pernicious and confused, because it's sort of like, well, what is a real job? That like,
well, you've got to be
corporate jobs. I would say are not real.
The Protestant work ethic.
It's not clear what value add that they provide. But anyway,
if you're sat there for 8 hours every day, James, even if you only do 1 hour of stuff, right? Because it's got this, it's culturally dressed up in. Have it, in is it Max Weber's The Protestant Work Ethic? I do think there's a lot of truth in the idea that there's this sort of inherent lingering morality from Protestantism that's sort of like, well, work has got to be something you don't enjoy, otherwise it's not real work as well. Like it has to be something that builds your character, because you're fallen. And so if if you're a teacher or a nurse or something, well, the pay for doing that is inherent in the fact that it's enjoyable in some way. But a real job is one, where you don't enjoy it, where you're miserable, and it builds your character.
I think that this might be more of a thing in the Anglosphere. If you look at work hours, I mean, they've fallen all over the industrialized world, but from what I recall, they're a lot, well, they're lower in continental Europe than they are in Anglo countries. And I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons for that are beyond mere social factors, because there's like political aspects of that as well, high taxes and different things. But I think part of it may be a cultural thing about the place of work, or the perceived importance of work as a character building exercise. But yeah, anyway, I don't like it when people, well, I mean, a real job thing can be like a good way to, I don't know, make fun of Twitch streams or something. But I think that it's really unclear what a real job means. Like, a lot of people
I just started reading this by the some of the effective altruism people, and it's actually a pretty decent book. Yeah, it's got some pretty decent advice in there about I like, because some of the statistics that they bring to light on job selection, for example, actually does alter your perspective in a kind of counterintuitive way. Like, when they talk about, when you think about, well, doing something useful, you pretty obviously think, well, medicine and being a doctor, and then they show, well, how many doctors per 100,000 people actually improves, like the well-being of people in that population. And it turns out that in most first world countries, it's something like, I think it was like 1 in 100,000. Once you've got one doctor per 100,000 or something like that, then the curve sort of flattens out. And that makes you think, well, that's not necessarily the best use of my time then. And then there's a bunch of advice about, well, if you can earn more and you can give to charity in certain ways, but here's how you want the workplace to actually look like, or here's what you might want to get. And I think that that's a good way to think about it. And not a lot of those considerations, are like, what's viewed as a socially acceptable real job from the point of view of, you won't get like, it's about like having a healthy environment and having like your psychological needs taken care of, not about just working 40 hours doing whatever is like socially acceptable. But
yeah, I think that there's a lot of good insights from the EA movement, and 80K is the organization that obviously focuses on career choice, about some of these factors that are typically neglected. There was a big, well, this was about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago now, a big media coverage when some of these ideas were first being publicized, about the idea of earning to give, like working for Wall Street to donate money. And the EA movement has de-emphasized that recently, partly on the back of what they perceived as negative publicity there. Although personally, I think that most publicity is good publicity, but that's another issue. But the point though is that just like the idea that the idea of a lot of people, especially in the charitable space, that you would work for Wall Street is just sort of anathema. And like, because that's bad, right?
Yeah,
and that's also a job that, well, they're the bad guys, yeah, and that's a job that you do for selfish reasons that makes the world worse. As opposed to working for charity, which is a job you do for selfless reasons that makes the world better. And I think there's something to be said about that, but there's also something to be said about the opposite view, where, well, if you can actually make a lot of money and do a lot of good with it, then
and then you can reallocate those resources.
I also think that Wall Street is more morally complex than just thinking of it as evil, but that's another issue as well. But so that's one of the things I really like about the EA movement, is that they, these sorts of conventional ideas that are not subject to criticism are not seen as sort of sacred and are subject to. I mean, there's plenty of different views, of course, in the EA movement, but I like that the way they sort of critique some of these, particularly about charity. There are a lot of kind of sacred cows we have about charity in the West, at least, that I think we should seriously examine.
Yeah, but in terms of dissertation, then I'm half of a mind to do something about philosophy of religion. I can't be half. I was going to give you 3 options and say it. I'm a third of a mind about doing something about philosophy of religion, a third of a mind about doing something about logic, and maybe a third of a mind about doing something in philosophy of language. Because I have been, I've been interested in reading like Austin and Grice and how they try to account for meaning. But I basically think what happens in a lot of the philosophy of language discussion is when people, or Davidson's semantics as well, is when people try to give a philosophical account of semantics, it just sort of ends up pushing the question of what meaning is back to like this philosophy of mind question of like what is it that it's like to be anything at all, sort of thing. Like you just end up sort of like developing a theory or a nice neat system that accounts for, you know, like how syntax connects to this thing that you're terming semantics or whatever, but there's not like this deeper, like an explanation that I want is an explanation that really like illuminates the aspect of the thing that you know, like I'm like, oh yeah, I get it now, I understand what that thing is. I don't feel like I've ever got that reading any of these philosophical theories of semantics. And so maybe doing so, but I do think, you know, it's like, is a master's dissertation even am I going to really make progress on a big question like that? Would it be better to pick a more like normal question that is maybe neglected and try and actually make there's all those sort of things that come into it.
I certainly believe you can make progress in a master's thesis if you pick a sufficiently like well chosen and well defined question.
Yeah, that's probably right. Well, I'll have to think about it more over the next couple of months, I think, before I start really reading into the specific question.
One thing about theories, well, philosophical theories more generally, I think this is especially true in philosophy of language, is that different theories attempt to do different things, and so they're not even always mutually exclusive. Although, I mean, some of them are, but in some cases they're like a chapter I was just reading of the book that I mentioned, talked about 4 different conceptions of internalism versus externalism in semantics. I won't try to explain. I'm still trying to get my head around them. But and the point is that at least in theory, you could hold any combination of those, which is, I think, like 16 possible sets of views. Not to say that all of those are occupied, but the point is that when you're looking at, like, is this theory compelling to me? Does it answer the question that I want? It may be just that it wasn't designed to, right? And it may even be that some inchoate pre-theoretic idea of what we're looking for doesn't even sort of make sense we may not even have a clear enough idea in our own minds about what we're looking for in an explanation. And I think that's something we have to be open to as well. This is something that I've sort of found increasingly as well, that in my own reading, that you have to balance it between thinking, well, this theory isn't answering the questions that I think are important, or it misses these points. And on the other hand, thinking, do I really know what I want in a theory? And can I articulate that in a clear enough way? Because maybe I'm just confused in what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's true.
And maybe they're just trying to do something different to what I'm interested in. And that means that, it's part of, let me put it another way. I think a large part of the battle in philosophy is finding a philosopher who is trying to answer the very specific question in the very specific way that you are interested in answering it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean people who are doing it differently are wrong. I mean, some of them may be. It may simply be that they're answering very slightly or substantially different questions in different ways. And it can take a long time to figure that out sometimes, I think.
Yeah, that's probably right. I guess I've just found myself, as I've come to terms with a lot of these theories, I've just found myself deeply intellectually unsatisfied with like the reason like I'm reading some of these things is because I'm interested in uncovering some deeper aspect about the world and stuff, and instead I just kind of find someone playing a game with tools that they've created, you know, like I'm just going to take I'm going to take Tarski's schema, and now I'm going to pretend I've sort of solved a problem by saying, you know, snow is white means snow is white or something. I'm like, well, that's not really revealed anything, you know. Well,
take something like Ramsey sentences. I don't know if you're sort of familiar with those, but this is an attempt to account for things like intentionality by stripping out the terms that you don't want and then giving a functional explanation of it. I mean, I think they're kind of interesting, but there's been a huge amount of work on this. Ramsey sentences end up being like really long and clunky, and they're very hard to really make any sense of. And I'm just giving this as an example, right? That it's not entirely clear to me how much value you get from doing this, but this has been a huge area of research. Another example would be applying modal logics and other types of logics to all types of philosophical questions.
Anything.
Or
computer science as well.
I'm not saying there aren't applications, right? But you can apply lots of formalisms or approaches to lots of different questions. It's not always clear what the significance of this is, like what progress. By the way, this doesn't just happen in philosophy. This happens in science all the time as well. I think that it's worse in philosophy because the disciplines often have less clear standards of success and
yeah.
other things like that. But it's a big problem in science as well. But yeah, so I agree. There's a lot of work that I seriously question the value of in philosophy or approaches where I'm just like, even if this is true, I just don't know. I don't know what this tells us that's interesting, at least to me. I mean, I guess that's somewhat subjective, but so I sort of share some of that frustration. And that's one of the reasons that I think that it's important to try to find philosophers who are working in a kind of framework or like in a direction that is aligned with what type of explanations you think are worth pursuing.
But I think that thing that I'm mentioning, that problem is exacerbated by the setup of academia as well, you know, the kind of publish or perish type structure, and the weird that there's like this grooming of your own public appearance or something that takes place where people are playing this people are playing this sort of game where they have to make themselves appear like sophisticated and like they're doing important stuff, and it just basically results in whenever there's something that's trendy, you know, everyone has to publish in their specific field. Like you know, I think a recent example of that is the Bayesian stuff, where it's like Bayesian this, Bayesian that.
Yeah.
Or now in metaphysics, it's like the grounding. You know, like you see even in the apologetics arena, you see like new grounding argument for God, and everyone's like grounding, and it's like people just talk about the same stuff but using a new word. It's the same. It's basically the same arguments, but you've just replaced contingent being or something with like grounded in or something. You know, and there's not really. It doesn't feel like there's any convergence on truth or progress or anything like that. I mean, obviously I'd have to talk about what progress means or what convergence, why should there be convergence on truth? But it just feels like what people are doing is playing the same game, but they've like bought new chess pieces or something, like now playing with like the Lord of the Rings pieces instead of the standard.
Yeah, I mean, again, this happens in philosophy, in science a lot as well. Neuroimaging is actually a good example of this. When fMRI came along, researchers started sticking people in scanners and getting them to do a task, like all sorts of tasks, and imaging it. And well, one has to be careful here. They often did have research questions, but I think that the research question often wasn't well linked to the methodology that was being used. And honestly, I have a big book here. Where is it?
Same.
The Cognitive Neurosciences, which is all about, like, a lot of this is neuroimaging stuff and trying to understand cognition in various respects. I don't know, like a lot of the papers in there, I'm just like, I don't know how much we understand about something because you can localize part of it sort of to of a very specific task to this region of the brain. Like sometimes
things like
there are a lot of papers
string
like
theory
that.
are probably that, you know, like in physics and like 10 years ago or something, where I just remember everyone used to, I mean, I was like a teenager at the time, but I just remember everyone always going on about string theory. Like I didn't understand why the hell there was all this buzz about it, but just everyone was always talking about it. Isn't that basically viewed as kind of crap now?
I mean, I'm not as familiar with that area. I mean, there's still a lot of research into that. I think that it's certainly not what is it, Lee Smolin, who's written about this, but it's not lived up to some of the promise that people thought because of theoretical and also difficulties of testing any of the ideas. But I think that the point is that what people in science, the way to get ahead in science is to do something novel, and a good way to do that is often to pick up a new technique, be that a experimental technique or theoretical technique, and apply it to some old problem.
Right.
And I mean, in itself, that's not a bad idea, but it's often that this is done in a way that is not, in my opinion, this is not sufficiently
buying a lottery ticket
thought out in terms of the link between the method that you're applying and the answers that you're expecting to get. And this is where I think that science, better informed by philosophy, or at least philosophical type thinking, can be helpful, because there you really, if you're doing it properly, should be thinking extremely carefully about the connection between the data that you're collecting or the models that you're constructing and the ultimate question of interest. In my opinion, it's very common for scientists to get bogged down or distracted by methodological issues, like very particular methodological questions. Like, go to a conference, and that's often what a lot of the questions about methodological points. And again, that's not bad, because you do need to focus on those. But I don't know. I often my approach to papers is just like, let me accept all of your methods are fine and you did everything correctly. What does your result mean for answering a question of interest? And often I just find myself thinking that even if I take everything at face value, I don't care about your result. not in the sense that I'm not interested in the overall question. It's just I don't think it tells us anything that's particularly interesting about that issue. And so I don't care about the methods at that point, right? I'll investigate the methods if I think that I need to understand them in order to understand the result, or looking at replicating or checking if there's problems. But like the best case scenario is that your result holds. But if that is not actually informative, then who cares in some sense? And I don't think scientists are often very good at doing that. So I think, more of a, it's more just more of a theoretical means ends focus, I think. I don't know. This is something I've talked about with different people before, and it's interesting to hear people's perspectives on their particular field. But it's something that I'm a big advocate on. I'm thinking very carefully about sort of like what your objective is, like what are we looking for? And often it's improving
to
theories.
To kind of constrain the space of questions that you're answering, and not just going like, well, what is reality of something, and vaguely
what would look like a good answer.
Well,
often,
but the problem
you'll find. So go ahead.
I was just you sort of mentioned a criticism of what would look like a good answer before, though, when you said you might have this pre-theoretical idea of what a good answer would look like, and that in some way interferes with your capacity to kind of interpret the evidence or the explanations that are being offered, because it doesn't neatly fit with how you sort of already decided it should look in some sense. So, but maybe, I don't know if this is what you're saying, but maybe what you're saying is something more like just constraining what those questions are, so as it's like really, really clear what the thing is that's trying to be explained or trying to be answered. And so like you say, the standards of success then are really clear for the work that you do, or what.
That's a big part of it. So I think that as a fruitful scientific endeavor should set up very as clear as it can standards for what it's trying to do, and then try to meet those as well as it can. For example, before collecting any empirical data, you should think very carefully about what that's going to tell you. And I think often still that's not done as much as it should be, or running simulations, which is a different type of data. Now, at the end of that progress, at the end of that process, which can take decades, you may find that whole paradigm that you're pursuing is ultimately not fulfilling the objectives that you hoped. Like, even though you made incremental progress, that the paradigm as a whole is not sort of getting you anywhere. So you may have to scrap that and sort of start from scratch, or not from scratch per se, but pursue it a very different direction. So like behaviorism might be a good example of this. We did learn some things about learning from behaviorism, but ultimately we needed a new paradigm. So you had the cognitive revolution came along. But so, you can be wrong about sort of the overall approach that you're taking, but I think that sort of you need to be cognizant of what that approach is, and then work very carefully within that in a way where you have a very clear idea about what the work that you're currently doing is going to do to help you achieve the objectives within that paradigm. So like if you're constructing a cognitive model, what is the purpose of that model?
Right.
What is it trying to explain? Often people will just sort of model stuff or run an experiment, say, and they talk about the very general objectives that they want to achieve. But I think you need to say, look, here's the general objective. Here's the sort of paradigm we're taking to that. And then within that, here's the model that we're going to test it. Like, you've got to sort of break it down very carefully and make sure all the bits connect. And that kind of sounds obvious, but I think it's often not done as well as it should be in a lot of fields. And I think that's where thinking about things that philosophically can help, because you want to be very careful in sort of checking that there's a sort of a series of links through your reasoning as to like, why does this matter in terms of getting to your objective? Yeah,
that's it. That's a good point.
By the way, that approach can be helpful in thinking about a thesis topic as well, I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like I said, I probably could do with maybe mind mapping out a few of my thoughts in each of those different areas, and kind of filtering down, or maybe laying out what the pros and cons of doing each one are, or what my ideas are about why it's desirable, what's like motivating me to do any of those, and then like filter it down to maybe a couple of choices, and then have a look at what, as you just suggested, think about what a good like philosophical research program over a few months would look like into one of those questions, and select based upon that. I think that's something I should probably be doing. But shall we talk a little bit about apologetics and bad apologetics in particular?
Yeah, sure.
So I don't know if you've been watching the chat, but apparently Cameron said he refuses to respond to us on Facebook. I've been blocked.
So does that mean Cameron has said on Facebook that he refuses to respond to us?
I'm not sure what it means, or if it means that he refuses. Yeah, he refuses
I
to
assume that
respond
that's
to us
what
on
it means.
Facebook, but will on other mediums.
Yeah, I doubt that that's what it means.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought I gave, a month or so ago, Cameron did his 3, sincere questions for atheists. I thought I gave a pretty good
one. Yeah, you gave good answers.
Sincere
to that
and very polite response to that.
But
so
you did jokingly. I think what he won't be able to cope with is you emphasize how sincere you were being, and that might have
but
been.
He did as well.
That might have been a joke
that
on
was...
his own sincere sincerity.
Come on, that. Anyway, but yeah, so I was thinking he might have said something about that. But yeah, I mean, that's a shame. But if he doesn't want to respond, he doesn't have to, obviously. So there's Braxton also has done a response to me, which I haven't responded yet. I reached out to him. Well, he actually reached out to me, but I asked if he wanted to talk, chat about it. He hasn't got back to me, so I need to follow that up and see if he's interested, because I'd rather just discuss it with him. But if he doesn't want to, then I'll have to get around to responding to that. But
I definitely would rather watch that as well if you can.
As a discussion,
I've not been able to get him to talk at all, but
I think that would be more fruitful. But anyway, so that's sort of BA adjacent stuff. But I mean, maybe Nathan, you could talk a bit about your thoughts and some of your concerns about the series or the approach, or
someone as well, just because it's a super chat, and then we'll
thanks, Jack.
Go on to that. Have you guys offered to debate Jay Dyer? I mean, I've been banned. I've been banned from his Discord now, so I can't talk to him. And the reason I got banned was because
you get banned from a lot of places, Nathan. It seems
you do. Well, I went. You can watch the end of this on a stream of his that started cutting out, and so he ended it. But I went in and I asked him why he was talking about jerking off with philosophy of language, as you call it. I didn't put it in those words. I said why he was talking about intentional context and stuff, when what he clearly meant was people were just equivocating on a word. And I was asking him about why he chose to use that language about intentional context instead of just talking about equivocating on a word. And then he told me, the history of Western philosophy, and mentioned a bunch of names. And I was like, well, I'm not sure why that's useful, but here's my question again. And then he told me I hadn't read some paper, so I didn't understand it. And then I pulled the old James Fodor on him, and I said, well, I'm not talking to the paper, I'm talking to you.
Yes. Oh, I hate it when people do that.
And he did. I don't think he deals very well with disagreement when people understand the words that he's using, because I think what he does is he uses those words to try and sort of bamboozle people, and I ended up getting banned from his Discord as a result. I mean, I'm still happy to talk to him if he ever wanted to, but I can't imagine it being very fruitful. Like, he's just I don't know what's going on with him, but he's like he can't converse about these ideas. If either I or James were talking to him, every other sentence would be like, "Yo, well, Gregory of Palomas, the Logoi, the Logi." No, well, yeah. It's like, well, just chill out. Like, what are your actual thoughts on this? Like, why? What are the reasons you can provide that someone should adopt this? And I just can't see it being fruitful. All of the people who follow him would just come over and be telling us that we're demon-minded Westerners or something. But I mean, I'm still happy to have that conversation. Yeah, well, because the thought world that him and his followers occupy is that satanic, like Jeffrey Epstein cults run the West, and it might have something to do with the Jews as well, but maybe not. But
it usually does.
But like the Eastern Orthodox Christianity, the ancient way, is like the true reality. And the way that the demons have infiltrated reality is through modernism and the West and stuff. So because we're raised and think in the terms of the modern West, our minds are kind of like infiltrated by all that mode of thinking and watching the Satanist produced films that have conditioned us into our sinful desires or whatever else. they think that it's a very weird collection of people to engage with and talk to. I can't.
Yeah, I
see
don't know. It doesn't sound very interesting to me. Well, as soon as it gets to conspiratorial levels like that, I just very rapidly lose interest in engaging with that sort of thing. I mean,
I don't think that would come up.
value with it, but
that wouldn't come up in the conversation though. In the conversation, he'd just talk about the mega question bag. Like that's where it'd go to eventually. You know, where he'd say, "What's a virtuous circle?" Like when we talk about things at this level, blah blah blah. Gödel's incompleteness theorem, blah. And you'd be like, "Well, what is Gödel's incompleteness theorem? Like, what can we actually conclude from Gödel's incompleteness theorem? Because it isn't that like at paradigm level metaphysical." At paradigm level metaphysics, we have to assume our conclusion in order to converse about anything. It's just a mess, like trying to communicate with this guy. So yeah, that's my thought.
Communicating across philosophical divides is surprisingly difficult, although I think it can be done successfully, but it requires a lot of effort on both sides. It still surprises me. I mean, obviously, when you're looking at like chat or YouTube comments, you don't really know who the other person is necessarily. But when even like if I post something on Facebook, where I feel like I spend quite a lot of time trying to very clearly articulate where I'm coming from or something, and then someone just says, like, when someone just says that you're wrong, and then gives a reason that seems to indicate that they just didn't listen to anything that I said, right? Which it's not the issue that they disagree, right? It's just like it's like they're just kind of refusing to see that I have a different view on it. That means that I differ from them on a certain point, and then they just say, "Well, you're wrong because you disagree on this point." Well, yeah, that's because I see it differently.
Well, that's
right?
what we're talking about. Yeah,
it's sort of. Yeah. So the ability to see that and acknowledge, yeah, okay, so we differ on a whole bunch of stuff here, and then let's try to make some progress on that and understand the basis of it.
Yeah,
as
because we
opposed to
share
just
a whole
finding
bunch of
something
stuff as well. Yeah.
where you disagree with me and then saying that I'm wrong because I have that view, while ignoring everything that I said about why I hold that. That I mean, I think it's a rare type of person who is actually fairly good at doing that. And those are sort of the discussions that I like to seek out. And I think that there are a few of those that I've done on my channel and on your channel as well. So that's it's good when it works. It doesn't always work, but yeah. But when people seem to show that they're just not able or willing to do that, I get really frustrated. And I just kind of lose interest in engaging a lot of the time.
But if someone's in touch with Jay and could convince him to just come on and have a conversation, I'm more than happy to do that. I just don't see it being worth the effort of trying to get through to him and set up a time and all the drama that'd be involved with that. If he's not really willing to, if the end result isn't actually going to be a good conversation, my guess is it'd be a kind of shit show, which I think is, it could be fun and entertaining, but I'm not prepared to go through all that effort to set it up really, to be honest.
Well, coming back to BA though,
yes.
Yeah. What are you sort of thinking on that? What is your thinking on that, Nathan?
So I don't know where to begin really. One of my thoughts would be, I think it's been really valuable to a lot of people, like a lot of people who have been on the fence about some of these questions and on the verge of being kind of bamboozled by some of the tricks of the trade in apologetics. I think our insights have helped some people to avoid some of those things, whether they've gone on to become religious, they've at least avoided the kind of toxic, weird nonsense that apologists are selling. And if they've avoided it and that's been healthy for them as well, I think it's been good. One of the areas that I think it could have been bad is the tribalistic side of atheism. Like I get comments that really frustrate me on the videos from people who clearly haven't listened to what we have to say or the people that we're criticizing, but they just see, bad apologetics, Christianity criticized, whatever, and they come in and like fart out whatever's going on in their mind about like, all these guys idiot. Like they'll be like, you two, they'll tell me that like we're wrong. The real problem with Christianity is that there's just no evidence for it or something. Like, yeah, and like that's just not what we were talking about. Like we're talking about a specific argument and why that argument fails. And I can tell from the way that some of these people talk, how they think about these things, and it's just as dogmatic and problematic as the apologetic side of things. And I don't know what we do to remedy that, because at the same time, I think what we do is valuable, and I really do want to push back against the ongoing craziness of the apologetics world, because I think it's a kind of be careful with my language here, but I do think it's a sort of blight on the collective human consciousness that it sort of exists in the form that it does, and we'd all be better off without it. But I don't want to also go about doing that in a way that promotes another blighted way of thinking about the world, which is this like toxic tribal atheism. And so maybe figuring out a way to balance that criticism with getting people who are atheists or are going to be atheists to have like a robust form of naturalism in some way, you know, where they really like have like clear critical thinking tools, or tools to piece together, tools to think about like metaphysics and philosophy. So that stuff's super important, but just like, you know, here's a way of thinking about these things so you can see some of the complexity of the issues that there is, and not just be like a dogmatic asshole about the things that you believe when it comes to this topic. I don't know if that should be a part of bad apologetics or not, but those are my thoughts. I don't know, I've said a lot, so you can respond to that, or come back with what your thoughts are in general, and we can talk about that afterwards.
Yeah, well, I know part of the concern relates to, or has related to the title of the series, which originally was my suggestion, I recall.
But I don't know that it'd be fruitful to change it at this point, because we've done so many episodes, and that's what's got like a bit of a name and stuff.
Well, that's part of the reason I chose it. It's sort of short and pithy, and it kind of gets
Yeah.
to the point of a large part of what we're doing there. I think, I mean, I don't have a problem with the name, because I think that a lot of what we cover is bad apologetics, and also it's just a title. It's not intended to be like a full synopsis of everything that we do. So I don't personally have a big issue with that. And if other people do, I don't know. I just think that that's more their problem. But in terms of the content, which I think is more important, this is always a challenge. So my overarching objective is to promote critical, rigorous thinking about important topics from a diversity of viewpoints, like considering alternate perspectives and encouraging dialogue, respectful and substantive dialogue between worldviews. That's my overarching objectives. And a sort of a subset of that is providing a robust critical response to particularly evangelical apologetics, because that's what I'm more familiar with. That's what's quite dominant in the Anglosphere. Not exclusively, but I would say that's a big focus. So that's more about what I see BA is about. Again, not exclusively, because we do address other things as well. Now, like there's other branches, there's other avenues that one could take. Like you can go down a more philosophy promotion kind of branch, right? Where you just sort of talk about and try to promote good philosophy, which I think can be valuable. There's another sort of approach.
But I think that gives the apologists a free pass on some of the more harmful, you know, like when some of their ideas are applied, they can always withdraw into, well, you need to engage with the philosophy, and in the meantime, we're just going to like tell all these women really harmful stories about who they are and what their role is in the family, and like screw up a bunch of these people with toxic ideas of spiritual warfare. But first, you must address the metaphysics, you know.
Yeah, well, that's something that I'm. Well, this is where I was sort of going with that, right? Because I think there's a lot of value in that general sort of philosophy promotion. At the same time, I think that it often can be very elitist, and I've criticized Joe Schmidt on that basis before, and I'm going to be talking with him soon, so that'll be good. Maybe we can discuss a bit of that. Not that it intrinsically has to be, but I just think it can be that way. Because there's, when that's your particular focus, there's, I think, a fairly natural pressure to increase how in-depth it is and increase the jargon and things like that.
And it doesn't necessarily illuminate anything. It's just,
well, that's the other thing. Yes. Yeah. So, but also I think from what you're saying, Nathan, philosophy can be, and I think in some ways has deliberately been made into a shield. I mean, apologetics kind of literally is about doing that, right? A shield for certain religious beliefs. Now, I don't want to sound like too tinfoil hat there. I don't mean it in that sort of way. I just mean, like, if you look at things like what Craig has said, again, I'm most familiar with him, so that's why I mentioned him. He's talked about the renaissance of Christian philosophy in the academy in the last.
You just posted about it today.
Really? Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
So he talks about that, and people like Swinburne and others are a part of that. And I know that they have apologetics programs. They push people through masters and PhD degrees. They want more Christians in the academy doing this sort of work to make it respectable, and also so that. And again, Craig literally talks about this. He says, "Look, ordinary Christians shouldn't worry themselves about these sorts of problems. They should just realize that there are really smart people in the academy who deal with this and publish all of this stuff that addresses it, and that should be that they should sort of accept that and just sort of not worry about it, basically." And in terms of the atheist critiques, they use the academy. Again, when I say that, I'm talking about people like Craig who follow that approach. I'm not meaning every Christian apologist does this, but people like Craig use this very consciously and deliberately as a shield for criticism. It's like, well, you haven't engaged with all this literature, sir. He's done this with respect to Apologia, for example, like explicitly said things like that. Many of the atheist popularizers on YouTube have this criticism levied at them, not always entirely unreasonably, by the way, but I'm saying that when you have the scholarship that it's a very technical, detailed level, it means that it's basically inaccessible to almost anyone who's not a professional there. And when the Christian side of it has so much more funding in terms of like the programs that they have, support they can get from seminaries and other things, and so much more interest in it than the atheist side. Yeah. Then there's going to be an imbalance, and I think that's one of the reasons there is an imbalance. It means that if you just then only approach it from the point of view of let's just talk about good philosophy, I think that you kind of are almost conceding, sort of, you're entering the playing field in exactly the way that they want it to, which is let's talk about the philosophy in a very technical way that is almost completely inaccessible to most people. And then when they go to their congregations or whatever, they can just sort of report that, Christian philosophy is flourishing and the atheists are, don't have good responses, or at least these issues are contested. And so you don't have to worry about it because we've got good responses, right? Yeah. Again, I'm not saying every Christian does that or every Christian apologist, but I think that absolutely this happens, and Craig explicitly talks in this way. So I use that as a specific example. So I'm not trying to straw man here. I think that needs to be pushed back against explicitly. And I don't think that a general philosophy focus does that as well in the same way. Plus of my concern about it being kind of elitist, and it also attracts somewhat of a different crowd, I think, that is interested in the kind of atheist promotion / counter apologetic sort of stuff. So I'm not saying that general philosophy approach is a bad thing. I'm just sort of articulating why it's not exactly what I am interested in doing on YouTube or necessarily with the BA series. Obviously, we try to put a lot of content into that, like the philosophical content, because I do want to encourage people to think in that way. But it is a different kind of focus, a different a different purpose.
I think I agree with that as well, because I think a lot of our value in doing BA for people has come in that we're able to engage with what's being said philosophically, but we're also able to kind of take a step back and assess and offer a criticism of the sociological aspects of apologetics, or even the psychological. And I know that psychologism, it's not charitable or whatever to psychologize your opponents, but I think in offering commentary like we did, for example, on the rationality rules versus capturing Christianity thing, when it's very transparent, some of the underhanded things that Cameron, for example, was doing in trying to disparage people's disparage maybe isn't quite the right word, and trying to muddy people's views of Stephen's kind of character and stuff in that discussion, or trying to something Braxton often does as well, trying to control the narrative in a particular kind of way that paints the people who he's against as anti-intellectual idiots and Christians as these people who care about philosophy and stuff. I think being able to criticize those narratives and take a step back, jump into the weird postmodern world of French thinking about reality and narratives. I think that actually does add some utility to what we do, because it's we can play the game when these are the things set up, and we can also step outside of that game and play the meta game of human discourse and where apologetics fits into what broader society and cultural issues and stuff. And I think that offers value to a lot of people, because not everyone is coming at the discussion from a philosophical point of view and a philosophical background. Some people might be just being introduced to some of these ideas for the first time, actually, when they view either the apologist video or a response video to the apologist. They're just starting to think about religion in philosophical terms. But what they are familiar with is where philosophy, where religion fits culturally, you know, into their life and their thought world, and so that we're able to comment on that aspect from that point of view means that it relates to people and they can immediately come to terms with some of the things we're saying, as opposed to it just being inaccessible terminology that you've got to read up on and nonsense like that. So yeah, I do think there's value in it for people.
Yeah, I also, part of this is maybe motivated by my own experience when I was sort of in the process of thinking my way through leaving Mormonism. I would search out, well, this is almost coming from the other way, but it's a simple point. I would read things that were critical of certain aspects of Mormonism or that made a certain argument, and I'd want to hear, well, what's the Mormon counter to this? Like, what's the apologetics? Now, Mormon apologetics is a thing, but it's far smaller and less developed. I think it's a bit more now than it was like 10 years ago, but it's still a lot smaller than, you know, the evangelical sphere. But the point is, I would be always looking for a counter. And particularly at that time, I wasn't very well aware of or understood the broader philosophical discussion or like historical issues and things. I would be looking for like specifically this argument, like what's the counter to this, or what are the criticisms? Or even if I wasn't looking for it, I might search it and then find, oh, here's a different view. I'll have a look at that. So I want to make sure, because of that experience, and it wasn't always easy to find that sort of stuff, it's important to me that people in a position of thinking through things have those resources available, so that Christians aren't dominating the narrative and there are robust responses. And I've been critical of much of the new atheist literature, although I think it's done some good, in not being very intellectually rigorous in responding to apologetic side of things, which has meant that Christian apologists have been able to, in some sense, take, in some sense, rightly, in some ways, the intellectual high ground on some of these points. And it means that if you, I think it's changed a bit, but if you look on things on like YouTube or books on Amazon or wherever else, or even just websites, there's a lot more discussion about these sorts of arguments, like Kalam, for example, or resurrection, from a pro than from a con point of view, like for or against, especially if you weight it sort of by rigor and degree of detail and things like that. And I like to think I've made a bit of a contribution towards pushing against that with my book and some stuff on my blog and the YouTube channel and so forth. But the point is that a lot of those people are accessing these philosophical and scientific issues through these particular questions and like Googling those terms and the arguments and so forth. They're not many of them are not going to watch general videos about epistemology or philosophy of religion or whatever, but they will look at, potentially at least, they will look at contrary views about these specific arguments, like, oh, I want to know what the atheists say about this particular issue. So that's why I think it's important to like talk about, say, arguments of the resurrection, which philosophers typically don't discuss very much, like atheist philosophers, because that straddles like history and philosophy in a way where that's pretty much dominated by Christian scholars. Not all evangelical, of course, but it's dominated by Christian voices. And I think it's important for atheists to have a voice there. When it comes to arguments like the Kalam, there are not, like Oppie and others, atheist scholars do have published on that, but they don't really popularize it nearly as much. They've been doing some discussions on YouTube in the last few years, which is good, but still, compared to what like people like Craig and many other Christians are doing, the popular side of it and the side that people will see is dominated by Christian apologists. And I think it's important for the atheists to have a firm foot in the camp of here's some robust responses to these, and also pointing to the literature for those who want it. Not even necessarily like, obviously I'm persuaded by the atheist side, but even from a meta point, even if we're wrong, like there should be a robust discussion to be had here, to be presented here from both sides of it, right? It shouldn't just be, I mean, I guess Craig would disagree with this, but this is my sort of meta belief, right? It's very important for people to have a good presentation from both sides. And so that's why I feel like Bad Apologetics filled a little bit of a hole there in terms of providing a resource where we specifically respond to some of these arguments, where there isn't always a lot of in-depth material about that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I was thinking as well, as you were talking about, you know, some of the things we've done on near-death experiences and stuff, where it's not just, you know, like, it's like that. This is a fringe part of the apologetic that Gary Habermas or whoever else sort of trots out, but that's also gonna not. It's not just counter this evangelical stuff. There's also a big movement of like weird near-death experience people who an episode like that can perhaps address in a certain way and or give people clearer thinking on or something. So maybe then, what was I thinking? Yeah, maybe we should think about, well, firstly, frequency and format going forward, and then maybe after that we can talk about after that we can talk about topics that we want to cover. So in terms of frequency and format, I mean, I think because of the length that we do them in and the amount of stuff that we cover, it's very difficult to do one a week, or like, or even one every 2 weeks. And I think that that's because if we cover 4 or so hours worth of videos, that means that in those 1 or 2 weeks, there's like 4 or so hours worth of videos we need to watch beforehand, and then there's like a whole Sunday that we spend commentating on them. And I think maybe I feel with other things going on in life that maybe like once every I'd be happier to do them, I think, to do them with shorter intervals and do it in like seasons. So we're going to do like 6 episodes or something, like one every other week, or if we did longer intervals, like one a month, but it's just continuous. And I don't know if you have any preference there with regards to those options or thoughts, of your own about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, well, I don't want to speak too much for you, Nathan, but I have less time than I did when we were doing some of the content last year, because I've started my PhD now. Right. And as well, I think we've got a sort of a basis to start from with some of the earlier episodes that we can kind of maybe address more niche or particular points now. So I like the fact that it's long form. I think we should stick with that. That doesn't mean there has to be as long form. That's just sort of, we just sort of talk for however long we sort of felt like. I don't think that there needs to be a specific length, but I'd certainly be, in general, open to looking on the more of a 4 or 5 hour length episode than an 8 or a 9 hour length episode. But we can do even shorter than that if we wanted to. But I do think there's a value to the longer form discussion than the usual sort of, like even Cameron's videos, which are on the longer side, are usually 60 to 90 minutes, I think. And even those I often find are too short. So like a couple of hours, I think, is 2 to 3 hours is a decent amount of time, and 4 or 5 can be enough to cover one longer video. So that's in terms of time. In terms of frequency, I think once a month would actually be a good thing to aim for. I think that's achievable for me if we spent a few hours once a month covering a particular topic or like a couple of videos. That gives me time to read stuff and watch the videos in advance and so forth with my other commitments.
I think that's right. That would work for me as well.
And in terms of whether we want to do them in seasons, I mean, I don't know. That's kind of up to you. I think there may be times when we want to take a break for various reasons if we're thinking about doing this sort of longer term. So there's maybe some value in doing that. Like now we're kind of reevaluating and taking a bit of a direction. So we might do that in future. So if you want to sort of number them season wise, then that maybe can
maybe, but it might be continuity could be good as well. I can't.
I think it's up to you whether you want to do that. I don't have a strong view on that. But in terms of topics,
well, maybe just before topics as well, in terms of format, let's just say shorter videos as well. Because that is going to be a time commitment from both. Like how do you want to approach? Some people have wanted shorter topics, and there's a few things I've thought about this. One of which is at the end we tend to do like a 5-minute summary where you go on like a crazy rant and summarize everything. And I don't know if it would be useful to clip those out and say, like episode 4 TLDR or whatever, and put those up. Or I don't know if you'd want to sit down after the fact, look at the timestamps, do like 4 or 5 slides and just cover like what the crux of the issues are that we covered in like a 10-minute video. But have you got any thoughts about the shorter format thing and how we would go about doing it?
Yeah, like you mean 10 or 15 minute video.
Like
I mean, people have been asking for that for a long time, and I've been wanting to do that for a long time. The main limitation for me is time, because in some sense, now there's a famous English writer, I forget who it was, someone in the chat I know, said, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long letter. In some sense, short can actually take longer than long, because you have to spend a lot of time thinking about what not to include.
Editing and cutting things that I specifically think if we wanted to do it based off the YouTube video, it would just take ages to like get a 7-hour video in a freaking video processor, and then you cut it out and everything, and then it takes time for the video processor to process the bits you cut out. And
this was sort of my process in thinking about it and thinking, well, what if we cut bits out of the BAs? And I was thinking that's almost certainly going to take longer than just recording something new. But then if we record something new, then, well, what does that look like? And I'm not actually sure that a summary of a BA video is even the best short form content. I feel like if I was, I mean, I still do have an intention to do this. I've been promising to do this. There's another project that this is a bit of a teaser actually. There's a project I've been working on literally for years, on and off, that I've very close to finishing now. And that's been taking up some of my time that I'm hoping then to be able to devote to doing some other content. So it doesn't really have anything to do with philosophy, but some of you maybe it's a history related issue. So there'll be a video coming up within the next month, hopefully, about that, which has taken an absurdly long amount of work. I don't know that the payoff is worth it, but I like it. So it's going to happen. But anyway, so that's actually something I've been spending a lot of time on. I want to get that finished, and then hopefully I'll have a bit of spare time to be able to devote to making some short form videos. My personal view there is that it may make sense to simply do topical videos of a 10 to 15 minute length that are basically scripted for whatever we want to say in that amount of time. That is a summary of an argument, possibly related to a BA video, but not in any very straightforward way. I think that BA is designed to be long form content that's discursive and like strongly analytic in the sense that we take an idea and like we talk about it and drill it down. I don't know that directly summarizing. I mean, I do the summary at the end to try to remind people what we talked about. It's not really supposed to be a substitute for the video because taken by itself, it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense or be very like it's not supposed to be taken by itself. It could be interesting to people. I mean, it may be interesting to clip those and put them somewhere, but I wouldn't necessarily say that in itself would be a great video. So my intention has been and still is to basically to start a series of shorter videos. One thing is that there already is more content like that. So that's one of the reasons I still think that it's going to be valuable because we have our own, approach and things. And I like to arrogate myself the idea that I have some valuable things to say about certain issues, but I do think that there's more on that compared to the long form content, which is why one of the reasons I think I focused on the longer form. But yeah, I guess my short answer is I think it would be more useful to just do like it could be a tie-in series, BA minis or something, but I think that they should be done separately, essentially.
And what you don't think they should touch on the same content that we?
Oh no, they could touch on the same content, but I don't think that they should be like clipped from or like directly made from the BA or even trying to summarize that.
Maybe maybe something that could be good for the purposes of that would be if we did like, I don't know, 5 to 10 slides on the argument as something that we're addressing in what we think are the most salient points, talk through them in a scripted manner. And then maybe to the end of that 10-minute video, we could clip the end roundup from the BA so that people like get an idea. And maybe that would work, because it would link it into the big video. Yeah,
it's an idea. I think one issue though is that if I were to start a series of like shorter videos, it's some of the videos that we cover, some of the BAs that we have done and probably will do cover a number of videos which are thematically related.
Yeah, but they are different.
Would I think be better to do maybe a couple of shorter videos on those. So I don't know that it'll be like a one-to-one thing. It's another reason why I don't think it's... That's a good point.
Yeah, because then which one of those do you put the end bit? Yeah.
Yeah. And people are, I mean, I even seen this in a couple of comments in the chat. Some people are very, how to put this? They're very critical of if you don't cover something, which is sort of ironic because even if you talk for 9 hours, that you can't cover everything. So the more you condense, the more that criticism is going to become prominent. Now, in itself, like, I mean, people can make that criticism, but at the same time, you want to make sure as much as you can that it's clear what you're trying to achieve with a particular video.
Yes.
So that's, again, one of the reasons why I have a preference for somewhat longer form, because even like when I do my recording videos, they're often like a couple of hours, because I like to give qualifications and then present some of the nuances of it. If you make a 10-minute video, which is like, here's a response to the Kalam or something like that, that just, a lot of people are immediately put on the defensive because you're basically presenting as like the answer, even though that still happens in the 2-hour video, but like, I think it's accentuated when it's in that form. So again, the fact that it may annoy some people is not a reason not to do it, but it has been a reason for me to be somewhat more cautious about how I present it, because I don't want to present it as like a knockdown in 10 minutes. I don't like that approach. But I think
record a start bit, James. We'll just record a start bit that can say, I don't know, like that BA, what did someone say? BA bits or BA minis or whatever, where we discuss the main where we discuss the main points that can be found in our longer videos. These are not, I mean, we'll think of something scripted that sounds a bit better than this, but these are not to be taken as knockdown arguments, but these are just summaries of some of our longer content which can be found, and then put the link.
Yeah, something like that. I think would be good. A lot of it's about setting the expectation and the discourse, because I really don't like sort of debunking type videos.
Yeah, I agree. It's like it's once and for all settled. Like here we go. I bet you've not heard it before, but premise 2 is wrong. So boom.
Yeah, I mean I think it's exactly the wrong model of philosophy.
That's where Cameron is. That's what we're criticizing. Is this like vicious circular?
I mean that was part of what the 500 arguments against Christianity was.
That was like the joke that no one got. Yeah, well,
I think there were some good arguments in there, but the meta joke was like, this is a silly way to do it, and we explicitly said that.
And the joke was that we were like wasting a day. Well, not wasting a day, but the joke was that we were spending so much time doing it, and it clearly is fruitless. Like that was the joke. And there was also, I mean, there's layers here. It's like a cake, right? But it's also like the more time you have to do this, the more you can come up with, and the more it would take to refute. Right.
Like, so imagine if you're paid just to do this, to come up with arguments for God. Imagine how much you can come up with. Like, I had to do this we did this in our spare time. Like, so this is sort of the meta point. Like, if the more you have, the more resources and time you have, the more stuff you can come up with, and at some point it just becomes ridiculous, which is sort of what we're trying to establish with the 500. So anyway, but I don't want to feed into that narrative too much, but there is also a room for concision. I'm a fan of that as well. So yeah, Onion, exactly.
A Shrek fan. Ogres have layers, donkey.
They stink. You leave them out in the sun, they start sprouting little white hairs. Yeah. No.
The best film that there is. I need to watch Shrek again soon. Okay, so shorter videos. We'll think maybe should we put like actions and plan though, because I get the feeling that we'll have a tendency to like say this and then just never do it, and then like in 6 months' time or something we'll be like, yeah, and we'll do when we get onto the shorts. Let me tell you guys, when we get onto the shorts, they're going to be something else. Like what can we do? Should we just set up a Google Doc or something where we're writing out the script to try and do one of these things, and like actually
well here's an idea. So if we're aiming to produce a BA a month, we could also aim to produce a short a month.
Okay,
which could be about the same topic, but I don't know that it would have to be.
But we'd have to see how much work that is, because if it is a lot more work, then it might defeat the purpose of being like one a month. But we'll have to, we can commit to one and just see,
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a starting point. Also, again, my aim is to get this secret project that I mentioned finished within a few weeks. Like it's very close to being done. I need to actually finish the script and record the video. Once I've done that, I'll have a bit of extra time, which I wanted to devote some of that to thinking about short form content. Part of the thing about the short form is that I don't. This is the other side of it, right? And I think you mentioned this briefly, Nathan, when you were talking to me. That some people, particularly those who, well, I don't want to sound too conceited here, but in my experience, particularly people who are more concerned about the state of the discourse and being cautious and not necessarily just saying I have the answer, or we're always worried about, oh yeah, but I didn't read enough and I didn't read this other paper and this objection to this, and you can never put everything in, right? And I think we've said many times, I'm still learning a lot as well. We're going to get things wrong, we're going to miss things out. I don't think that should be a barrier to producing content, as long as we think the content is good and valuable. It doesn't have to be comprehensive or encyclopedic or anything like that, right? So the point is that, particularly for the short form videos, I don't think, though, I'm not anticipating those have to be highly researched. They really should be based on kind of where we're at with an argument. I mean, they can be based on things we've talked about in my book and stuff like that, right? And other stuff just from SEP. So I'm not thinking that they need to be, like some of the videos we've done, you and I like read whole books and did heaps of extra research, and those are fun, and I hope we can do some more of those at some point in the future, right? But I don't think the shorts are going to be anything like that. It should just be relatively simple summaries. Most of it is writing the script and then like recording it. And I think particularly if we're collaborating, then I think that should be doable for one a month. If we kind of want to make that an objective, we can see how we go, obviously, but I think that should be doable. So if we set up a schedule, we could kind of alternate releases. If you want to get like super actionable, and then we'll see how we go with that.
That sounds good. Okay, so then the next minutes of the meeting, but I don't know how people actually like do proper professional meetings. It seems like
well, you have an agenda for a start, which
yeah. But the next item on the agenda is this brings back memories. I remember in primary school being on the school council or something when I was about 8, and that they were obviously trying to socialize us into what the real world is like, and so you'd have the school council meetings, and it'd be like, well, who's going to do the minutes of the meeting, and who's going to write the agenda and stuff, and it'd be like playing adults in this bizarre way. Mitch says, thanks to both of you for the whole BA series. I've personally found it valuable and quite entertaining. Look forward to the new material, whatever form it takes.
Cheers.
And another positive one as well. So let's talk about content then. What content do you see on the horizon for the next few episodes or whatever?
Well, there have been a few responses to some of my stuff that is in need of response. So I mentioned
Braxton,
thank you.
I think
no, it's not Cameron. It's the other one. Yeah. So I need to follow up with him if he's interested in doing something. If not, then we could make responding to him plus maybe a bit more general discussion of philosophy of mind stuff. That could be an episode. I think that could be a good one. I mean, even if he wants to come on, then we can chat with him on an episode. Like, that'd be great as well. So either way, I think that would be good. Although I kind of doubt he's going to agree, but I don't want to.
As well, but hopefully,
I like to be positive. I'd really, because I really like chat with him about it.
But so I think as we get bigger, bigger, it might kind of force his hand, because then the payoff for him engaging with us is going to increase. Like with maybe when we're at around like 10,000 subs or something, it might be worth it for him from his point of view. But I think as we're lower in subs, it means I honestly do think that this is the way the calculation goes. It's like, well, there's. Like, I don't mean this to big us up, but I think there's like a big chance that I'm not going to come across well, and like if I don't come across well, like what am I really going to gain? Maybe like one person or something that is going to watch that, and even if I don't come across well, is going to think I did a good job. Well, it needs to be like a bigger audience. There needs to be more. Someone is happy to talk to William Lane Craig, whatever, and get destroyed because it gives you exposure to William Lane Craig's audience and the credibility of having debated with him and all that sort of thing. The same with Alex O'Connor and Braxton, when they were going to debate. It's like, because even if Alex O'Connor like destroyed him, and I don't know if that would have been the case, it's still like, well, he debated Alex O'Connor, right? The big bad boogeyman of YouTube atheism. And I think there's a bit of that going on in terms of actually.
Yeah, I mean, obviously audience matters. I think that, I mean, for me, the most important thing is the quality of the discourse. People have different priorities, though. And I know that Braxton has, I mean, his channel's part of his ministry, right? And I know I saw him talking about that, asking about this recently, like, should we focus more on outreach to atheists or like not other non-atheists? And I've heard him talk about this as well. So like, it's a strategic thing for him, which is fine, right? But that means that things like audience are definitely going to play a role for him. So I can understand that, as well as being maybe a little disappointed that quality of the discourse is not first and foremost, but he has his own objectives, so he's going to act in accordance with that. But anyway, so regardless of whether he wants to participate, I think that would be a good topic. Now there's someone else who's done a few videos on me. Now I can't actually remember the name.
Oh, the William Lane Craig student guy.
Yes, that's right. Which I haven't watched yet. I've been sort of well, for one thing, I wanted to wait until the series was finished, and another thing, it's a time sink basically to spend time watching.
Is he doing a series on you?
Well, he did. I think it's finished now.
Okay.
But the point is, I wanted to wait until that was done, and then I've been busy with other things. But I've intended to respond to that. Now, we don't have to do that in a bit. I don't even know if it would be a good one. I have to look into that. But that's another potential option.
That's an option.
Responding to some of that stuff, because I think it is important to respond to criticism if it's thoughtful. So
I still really want to do the apologetics industrial empire one at some industrial.
Yeah, the issue with that is a more research intensive one.
Yes, yeah.
So I think that'd be that as well.
Especially looking into the numbers, like time. If we looked into like publishing numbers of books, like how much they make, we could do like a comparison between books of how much material gets like recycled, and like I just bet there's tons of plagiarism and weird goofiness going on where it's clearly about the business aspect and people making a living out of this thing.
Well, I can show you
than...
that from Craig's book. Craig self-plagiarizes an insane amount. That was one problem I had when I was writing my book, is that I would try to find quotes from him or like passages where he talks about something, but there's like the same stuff in 5 books. I'm like, where did I read that again? Because it's in all these places. So even that I could show you there.
That would be a good one.
And by the way, it's self-plagiarism because he doesn't, for most of it, he doesn't cite it. So that's technically academic mispractice, although like people do it all over the place. So, well, I guess if it's not academically published, then I don't know if it counts as. But anyway, I still think it's kind of dodgy.
So there's that. Mitch has suggested in the chat,
topic.
Like the prosperity gospel type stuff. And some of these topics could be interesting. We obviously, because we wouldn't be addressing it from a theological point of view for starters. So that is most of the criticism of that people are going to come across is people criticizing the theology and being like, no, real theology is this. Whereas I think if we criticize it from questioning its philosophical assumptions as a whole and looking at the kind of sociological element and stuff like that, then that could be a different kind of criticism, and it could draw people who we otherwise wouldn't necessarily have outreach to. That could be the same could be said of that of a bunch of the kind of weird things that happen in American Christianity that we've not really looked at before.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I've mostly heard of it discussed in negative light because it's not really very popular amongst, really any Christian I've ever talked to, but I guess it does have its audience. But
it is big. If it's interesting because if you look at, for example, on YouTube, the numbers that, like Capturing Christianity is something pulls, that especially now they're quite low, but there's like a core audience who's involved in the space of apologetics and stuff. But interestingly, there are these branches that aren't in that space, in that ideological space, which are, one of which is the sort of, I don't know if you know of Michael Brown, one of which is like the kind of charismatic Christian YouTube. So it's people who their emphasis is more on the spiritual warfare and stuff like that. And I think doing a criticism of that sort of thing, like the charismatic YouTube, and because we could look at it from a psychology and mental health perspective, and how how people are being conditioned and having these triggers pressed and stuff like that are harmful ways of viewing the world, to say the least. And I think that there's a large audience that's at least, I don't know that they'd be receptive to what we've got to say, but at least we'd be, addressing that from our perspective. Yeah. And similarly with the prosperity gospel stuff, like there are a lot of people who watch those sorts of videos and who are into it. Another thing that I think, we've got the Jordan Peterson episode, and this could be down that avenue, to do with rationality rules, which we've been invited to do. But an episode on, there's like this weird, like the conservative alpha male type culture wars point of view, and I think that there's horrible ideas like that are both sociological. There's like economic ideas about what capitalism is that are tied into that. There's ideas about like being an alpha male and stuff, but there's also this residual religiosity that's tied into it, this idea of the conservative man and patriarchy and stuff. And I think it could be good for us to touch on some of those things and kind of and also offer a criticism of them, because there's quite a lot of people drawn into that branch of bullshit, and it'd be a bit different and maybe could be fun to look into for a month.
Yeah, it's another good idea.
I don't know if you had any other thoughts as well.
What was I going to say? Yeah, I think there's an ongoing need to provide critical responses to what the apologetics channels are coming out with, even though in some sense it's often more of the same. There's always more things to talk about there. So that would be another thing to have a look at. So particularly Cameron, I haven't really looked at too much of. I did recall him advertising a video recently based on an exciting new argument for God's existence. Which I have no idea what it was, but I just find that
that was the grounding one. That was when I started.
Oh, the grounding one, yeah. I just find rather amusing that it's like after all this time, there was yet another argument that we just I don't know, it just seems a bit silly.
Grounding.
I mean, the point is there's always stuff there to go over, and things we've talked about before that could do with a revisit. I'm just sort of thinking what we have. I don't think we've talked about Oh, okay. So here's one that we should talk about at some point, like Thomism / scholasticism.
Yes, right.
Which I
But
need to do more
that'd be
reading
a bit
on.
of
But
work. Yeah.
yeah, that would be more work. But I think that we should do that at some point. So that's on the list.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've just been finishing up. I got really bored towards the end, but this is actually a pretty decent introduction to some of that stuff. And I've got another book on that. But I think, I think that's going to be pretty metaphysics heavy if we do go down that route. But I do think again, what could be valuable is looking into and criticizing the expressions of Thomism within Catholicism, and not just Thomism, but I think looking at Catholicism and the kind of different sects within Catholicism and the monastic orders and how basically cult-like they are, and how they condition people into certain forms of thought. And then we can also criticize some of the metaphysics of those particular organizations and the way that they think about reality, because there is a kind of there's a group of Thomists, and again, they're very like it's like a pernicious religious group where they have their own kind of in-group language and way of talking about everything, and they're very convinced that everything that they think is completely right, and there isn't any way of intellectually challenging these ideas. And it's just a different system. It's just another system of thought with its own metaphysical problems, like every system of thought has. So yeah, that could be a good one, but a lot of work, I think.
Yeah, Thomism is interesting because, well, it's kind of like what you were saying. When you find someone who is when you find someone who has kind of entered into that space, it's like all they talk about in some sense is like that's their thing. Even more so than maybe someone who follows Craig or something like that. I mean, they can be a bit sort of culty as well, as can atheists, by the way. But like, I don't know, Thomism, it just seems to be so extensive and totalizing that respect. Like, oh, I'm a Thomist, and so here's like everything I believe from like 700 years ago. It's like, okay.
You know, it's quite close to empiricism, some of it. You might like some of the things in it.
Well, that's what Canadian Catholic said.
Well, he didn't understand what the hell he was saying, though, because
I didn't understand what he was saying.
Because, well, no, but I mean, he didn't understand his own thought system, because he kept saying stuff to you in that discussion where you were saying empiricism, and he was saying stuff that Aquinas like never really believed when he was talking about universals, for example, and that you can't. And you said, well, as an empiricist, here's what I think, and you said something to the effect of, well, like basically everything comes through the senses, and then things like universals, we perform some process of abstraction, right? Yeah. And in that process of abstraction, we conceptualize the universal, and that is actually exactly the same as Aquinas's views of what universals are. He just also thinks that universals are actually inherent in things, like there is, like there's an essence of humanity or something that is like in each person. But the actual idea that we have of a universal is an idea. It's not like we grasp some like
what's that view called? That Aristotle
hylomorphism.
That's the one, hylomorphism. Yeah.
But Canadian Catholic didn't understand any of this about the position that he's putting forward. I think Thomism could be interesting in that it is like a form of empiricism, so it's actually quite close to the type of thing that for example you would believe, but there's going to be some key differences in certain areas that I think also can be drawn out, and maybe but also might offer some insight that's overlooked in like a modern naturalistic system as well. So I think it could be an interesting one from that point of view. And I think some of the weird points are going to be like teleology and nature and stuff like that as well, which is going to be, which is going to bring up this whole wider discussion. Because like I was reading a chemistry textbook the other day, for example, and it said, what did it say? That something like atoms want to have a full outer shell of electrons or something. And it's like, this kind of teleological talk that's like, how do we actually decompose that? What does it mean? That kind of discussion could be quite fun.
Yeah, I think that's called the pathetic fallacy, or at least it's sometimes called that. I actually that is very common, even in like pretty high level, like graduate level, not necessarily text, but like teachers will talk in this way.
Yeah,
it like wants to go to the lowest energy level, like things like that. I think this can actually be. Obviously, they're not speaking literally, but I think that language can actually, we use it because it comes naturally, and I think it in some sense is a form of laziness. It's because we can't be bothered saying more
What the
precisely what
explanation
is
is.
actually happening, or maybe we're not even sure sometimes. Like, why does an electron go to its lowest energy state? It doesn't do it because it wants to. At least I don't think that we would want to assert that.
Well, it depends what we mean by want, right? Like as well,
Yeah.
and that's an interesting.
We'd say we could just say that it does, right? But I guess there's an idea of laws of nature that's maybe more than just an empirical
not normative,
regularity view, or is there, right? I often use the phrase that it tends to do this, and that is almost like a teleological view, like the elements tend to go to their natural positions in the universe. It's almost that sort of view. So it is kind of there's certainly some philosophy to be done there, but it's almost like just inferring desires is a way to kind of avoid thinking about that. But it can confuse students as well. So
well, I think so much of this stuff confused me. Like the first time I learned quantum mechanics in high school, and they talk about the observer and stuff like that, is definitely prone to lead you to think of like spooky goings on, which still seem prevalent, amongst a lot of adults who talk about these things, at least in popular spaces. But so that could be an interesting one. Any other topics other than Thomism that you think would be good to do? I feel like we've done historical. I almost feel like we could leave some of the historical stuff because it feels to me a little bit. I mean, maybe the need will arise again, but some of the resurrection stuff feels a bit done to death now. And the the other one is like Old Testament stuff. I don't know if you've seen any of the things that Kip Davis has been doing, but it's like, well, he's got a PhD in that field, and he's doing kind of like a bad apologetics type thing, looking at what apologists have to say about the Old Testament, and that is just really good and beyond anything that I think we'd be able to do on the topic, because like he speaks Hebrew and does research on the manuscripts and things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always going to be a place for revisiting old topics, particularly because people have different takes on things. But yeah, I don't see that there's an immediate need for that. I would like to cover some more of the philosophy of Richard Swinburne and some of his arguments for different aspects of Christian theism.
The inference to the best explanation type stuff. I think that could be interesting methodologically, like looking into the method that he's using and seeing where we would differ in terms of, like why he's saying it's the simplest or best explanation of things.
Yeah, and trying to sort of derive different aspects of Christian theology from various observations, which, for example, came up in the fine-tuning debate I did with Luke Barnes. He sort of made a vague appeal to Swinburne.
Yes, yeah. So
I've seen that appeal made elsewhere. I think that would be useful. Again, that's going to take a bit more reading.
Yeah.
But yeah,
so Swinburne's got an introductory book, I think, called Is There a God?, which is about 120 pages, which is meant to be an introduction to those ideas. And then I think his bigger book on that is something theism. I've forgotten. But I think covering both of those would basically do the job. Yeah, prophecies, people making prophecies and Trumpism and stuff like that. Maybe we could do one on that sort of thinking and the psychology of it and stuff. That could be a good different thing. So yeah, there's a lot of ideas there for us to go down. Maybe we could talk a little bit, unless do you want to talk about something else now, and I can park.
Go ahead.
The Jordan Peterson episode as well.
I
don't know what your thoughts are about that. So I think there's so much to talk about in terms of like his political ideas, right? Which I think you can be pretty good on, specifically his economic ideas about what the right thing is to do and why people are evil. Some of his allusions to anyone who wants any kind of social benefit system.
I don't even know much about his economic ideas, other than I know that he really doesn't like Marxism.
Yeah, and he buys into
which I don't like either, but he says some weird things about it.
He almost buys into like the Frankfurt School conspiracy theory of
I've heard of some of that. And he's used the phrase, what does he say? What is it again? Postmodern neo-Marxism, I think it is.
Yeah, I always mess it up on purpose, so now I get confused. I say like post-liberal neo-Marxist millennials or something. Yeah, but yeah, the cultural
Yeah,
Marxists and the postmodernists. And I don't think he understands what postmodernism is. I don't think he understands what Marxism is when he, like, if you said dialectical materialism or something, I think he'd just be like, huh? Like,
well, I mean, the irony that some others have pointed out in different ways is that, to sort of jump the gun here, but that the modern, that postmodern is post, partly refers to Marxism, because that's a modernist idea. So postmodernists don't like Marx. So it's a bit odd to now. I think that the thing that he maybe is referring to is, and because I studied some of this back in the day when I did politics or political science, is that there are a lot of researchers who draw on a range of different theoretical perspectives. So they may draw on Marx as well as drawing on people like Foucault, who are critical of Marx, and they can be classed together in some sense as critical theories. And like in some schools, they're explicitly taught like as different critical theories, but that doesn't mean they agree with each other. It just means they have some sort of family resemblance relationship as being sort of opposed to some sort of, I guess you could call it opposed to everything that the, what is it, the Glorious Revolution stood for, like capitalism, liberalism, and the traditional values of white Protestantism, or whatever it is you want to call it. But anyway, the consensus that a lot of sort of social academics disagree with.
So we've got that, but I think another thing that would be useful in that is we can talk about some of his lobster claims. Like that the hierarchies that are found amongst lobsters somehow emerge out of their nervous systems, which we share with them to a degree. So the hierarchies that we have, we can talk about like that argument. We can talk about the all meat diet that caused him to have.
Oh, that stuff is really weird.
Well, because he went on the all meat diet, right? So we can briefly talk about the benefits of that and like the macronutrient deficiencies that will arise out of that. But also how there's a video of him on Joe Rogan's podcast.
But he said it cured his depression or something, didn't he? Which is just...
He said that at the time, but also if you listen to him at the time, he says he drank 1 cup of cider, right? And he says it gave him a sense of impending doom that he didn't.
Oh yeah, I heard something about that.
And that was when he became really depressed and went on benzodiazepines and stuff. And like I think it could have been a cause in him like going down that weird avenue that he went on. And we can talk about how he didn't accept conventional medical treatment I don't want to make it just about his character, but what I want to
there's so much weird stuff that fits into his worldview, I guess. And so how popular he is, that's one of the reasons I don't know too much about it, because I just find it all very strange and bizarre. Like, how can you be, because I think he has helped people in his clinical practice from what I gather, but like, how can you be a competent psychologist and think that you can tell whether your diet has cured your depression? Like, you just can't tell something like that from your own personal experience.
This is a common phenomena of clinical psychologists. I don't know if you ever come across a book called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, but it's a common bias. It's a common bias shared by clinical psychologists where they sort of assume that they're experts in many things. And I think it's given rise to, like the memory retrieval, like, what's the word? Like there was an issue with memory retrieval, which wasn't well evidenced in the US in the previous century, where a lot of these clinical psychologists were like, if they don't recover the memories, then they're still repressing them, and if they do recover them, my therapy's been successful, and just thinking that they're experts in in things like this as a result of being a clinical psychologist without feeling the need to appeal to like evidence in different branches and stuff. And I think that
was a big problem. I think it was in the 80s when there were techniques to elicit suppressed memories through, I think hypnosis was one technique. I think there were a variety of techniques that were used. And these were admitted to court. And I think some people were convicted on the basis of this until the science of it completely unraveled. And it was basically found to be they were implanting memories. I actually mentioned some of this literature in my book because it's part of the body of evidence about showing how fragile memories can be and how it's actually relatively easy to form false memories. But anyway, that stuff is like really, it's a real, it's a real issue. Like that was really toxic, sort of everything that happened there.
And I think he views himself as an expert in a similar way, where he doesn't feel like the same standard. I don't think he has an awareness of the, as you said, the standards of success in other disciplines and of their methods, and I don't think he has an appreciation of those things, and I think we can draw that out, but I think we can also emphasize at the same time, like, here's where some of the things he has to say like do actually offer some practically good advice for people who are suffering, but then here's how adopting some of the things that he's saying about some of his characterizations of the way reality is, both metaphysically and politically, that lead to you suffering as you are now, will lead you into like a paranoid state of thinking about reality, and, you know, potentially going into like toxic cults where they think about what, you know, these grand conspiratorial metaphysics of good and evil battling it out, and you being at the kind of crux of that in your particular little life narrative. I think we can draw some of those things out.
I've seen a little bit of this culturally on YouTube, and well, I guess it's sort of inferential because they don't always sort of label themselves as being Petersons, but it's like there does seem to be a class of people who view their lives through a lens of like it's sort of a Lord of the Rings struggle.
Yeah.
Although it's, I mean, people will label the orcs and Sauron as maybe different things depending on exactly what their perspective is, religious or irreligious or whatever. But you know, and the most mundane things can be dramatized, and so it's the you know, every time it's the Battle of Helm's Deep when it's I mean, you know, not to go to the other extreme and say that, well, it's almost like if I don't think of my life that way, then it's just meaningless nihilism. It's like there's sort of a balance where we give value to things, but we don't, you know, over dramatize things and put it in this grand cosmic you know, specter, which somehow we're at the center of, which has all these weird things that come of it. So I think culturally that I think there's some good memes that come out of some of that that I've seen, but I don't know that it's a very healthy way to think.
Yeah, and but I do think that that's something that opens the door then for some of the kind of religious thinking, which places you at the center of this spiritual battle, and then you find yourself kind of trapped in a cult and a messy way of thinking and stuff. I mean, that's not happened to anyone I know, but you're permanently psychologically scarred. So yeah, I think some of that stuff could be really interesting, and just the general and this might be a little bit of reading before that episode as well, you know, like the Jungian psychology and the archetypes, and the way that the way that metaphysically he tries to cash out the psychology as if there's these platonic narrative forms that actually exist in the world.
Well, that was wasn't that his whole book, his big book
Maps of Meaning?
Yeah, that's the one. But wasn't that what that was about?
Sort of, yeah. It sort of is.
I've not read it. I've just read a little bit about it.
Yeah.
So you might know more than me.
And I think what we want to touch on is like, well, first, is that true to what Jung is trying to communicate? You know, secondly, like, what are the pitfalls of this as a philosophical view, where it steps beyond just a kind of where it steps beyond, you know, just a kind of psychological reality. But then another thing about Peterson's view is some of the things that he wants to call, you know, like absolute forms. It's not like a Platonist who's going to say, you know, like these necessary truths, because he's going to talk about them as if they are necessary truths, but they're clearly contingent. You know, like, for example, the symbol of the snake being used to symbolize chaos or something. Or, you know, like he's going to be like, that's like some necessary truth about reality. It's like, that's just clearly not the case, because you can, you know, there are cultures where the snake doesn't mean that. And so you're just wrong. Like, I don't know how else to, all that sort of thing.
Yeah, ideas like that I just find so strange.
Yeah.
Sounds like there's a lot to cover. So look forward to working through some of that. I'm sure you'll have a nice list for me.
Maybe you can read. I can email you Maps of Meaning. I've got it.
I did not want to read it. No, I did see. Well, maybe we talked about it at some video where we looked at a few slides from it or something, or some of these weird diagrams that he had in it. I remember looking at that.
And it's just not clear what they're. But people have like ridiculed him for this on Twitter, and then he gets really angry and, you know, like responds back saying, well, maybe you just didn't understand them, bucko. Like,
well, yeah. Actually, that's an interesting point, though, that I've been thinking about recently. So, if someone makes an argument or just makes a claim, right, and someone says, I don't understand that, how can you distinguish between the case where they don't have, like, they're just not trying hard enough, they haven't thought about it, they're being deliberately obtuse, which is a thing, right, versus it wasn't explained well, or possibly even stronger, not that it wasn't explained well, there's just no substance to it, like it actually just is incoherent. Like, those are all in general like possibilities. Of course, it could be both, right? But like, how do you actually distinguish that? Because I'm always I don't know what I'm always, but I think that often I want to simultaneously say that, like, this sort of maps and meaning and stuff. Like a lot of this is just nonsense, it seems to me. But at the same time, I want to allow for the space that, well, maybe I've like just fundamentally missed the point and haven't understood, because that does happen. Like, I don't know, like this is just, I think, a difficult issue to, because it comes up in lots of contexts as well. It's not just like this sort of Jungian stuff. Like it's a pretty general issue.
What you mean. I think I think a big key to look out for is like, is there an honest attempt on the part of the person that you disagree with to try and communicate this? And there's no other way to look for that other than the way that they try and communicate themselves and conduct themselves and stuff. And there are some things that are going to be evidence in favor and some things against, but I think by and large it looks like they're trying to honestly communicate that. It's good to, you don't have to assume that they're right. Yeah, right. They're trying to make it clear. So when something's unclear, they don't just like make it more unclear.
Is there efforts for can you see clear, well, I shouldn't say clear, can you see like real effort made to improve the clarity? Yeah, because I would say there's definitely a lot of stuff where that's not the case.
Yes, yeah. And avoid it. It's like, well, I'll only talk to you under the circumstances where you're like a big name and I can get a lot of money. Yeah. And then I'm willing to put my neck on the line, but otherwise I don't care to talk to someone and try and clarify things. That those things are red flags. But I mean, I do think I think in the case of Peterson, there's a bit of some of those bad things, but I do think he's honestly convinced of his ideas as well. And I think that doesn't mean that he's like right and we're wrong and haven't understood it. But I think what we can do is actually characterize the phenomena that give rise to the disagreement, like whether it's parts of his, I think there's parts of his psychology, like depression, for example, which are leading to him viewing reality in these like intense terms that reality isn't actually like. But then that makes these other theories become more appealing because they have to be accepted in order to like deal with those psychological issues, for example. And I think that when you start describing things in that term, it becomes clear why, in those terms, it becomes clear why the disagreement is actually taking place. And you can be like, well, here's why there's disagreement and why I don't think what he's saying is true, but nevertheless, he's honestly convinced of this like false set of beliefs and is trying to. But I agree, it can be difficult to discern sometimes because there's these borderline cases where people are popular or whatever, or trying to get popular for having a certain view, and it's not clear whether they're honestly trying to communicate or they're just being obtuse on purpose, or that can be difficult.
Yeah, I think that trying to look for honest and substantive efforts to clarify and explicate is that's a good strategy. I would say on the flip side of it, when you like really just don't get something, I think almost always you can and should say something more than just that. So you should like say, look, well, okay, so you said this, but I don't understand why you think this from it, or how that relates to the next thing you said. Like, try to make it a bit more specific, as opposed to just like, I don't know what you mean, or I don't know what you're saying. Because I mean, maybe that's all you can say sometimes, but I think in general, that shows that you're making an effort to try to understand what they're saying and to then focus it on what you don't get. Because I'm thinking about, sometimes where people have said that about things I say. I'm like, because I felt like I was very clear, and I'm open to the fact that maybe I wasn't clear. But if they just say like, I don't get it, or like, what are you trying to say, or something like that, I'm like, well, I feel like I can only just say the same thing that I just said, unless you clarify which part of it.
More,
like, you should give me a little more. Yeah. So I don't know. I think that, trying to look for, I don't know, like genuine intent and specifics where you can, in simple terms, provide them. Both ways is a useful approach there. But I mean, it can be difficult, obviously.
So in terms of the coming months, then I think maybe around the end of February, maybe March, will be this Peterson episode with rationality rules, and maybe that should be the main one that we prepare for. But what we could do in the meantime is we could do a Sunday on the response to Brexton's thing, if you want that, because I don't think that'll take that much preparation.
Yeah, I shouldn't do. I'll have to watch it, but apart from that, so we could look, if we want to do Peterson in March, then we could aim for, well, I guess it depends. We could, I kind of like the idea of having a set time that we aim for. That just helps me with planning.
I'm fine with the same time that we used to do on a Sunday. It's just whether you want to make it like the third Sunday of every month, or like something that
kind of would, even if we shift it when needed. It just helps me with sort of knowing what's sort of going down. Yeah, well, I'm just sort of thinking, what would work? If we're aiming for late, well, why don't we aim for, like, how would the 30th sound for doing a response to Braxton of some sort?
The 30th of
January.
30th of January. Oh, let me look
In
at
3 weeks.
Yeah, I think it'll be okay.
That should be the same thing. Yeah, if Braxton's interested in participating, then we obviously may need to shift that. But like aiming around then.
Yeah, that's clear for me actually. So that would work. Let me just add a time, and then the time will convert for you. Add guest. There you go. Right, I've given you the calendar invite for that. And hopefully I'll be back in Glasgow by then, because V's still trapped in Spain because she's got COVID and can't get on the flight to come over yet. So
how did you get back then?
Because I got a positive test the day before I flew. And then after I came back and landed, because I met my parents before going to Glasgow and was waiting for V, before I took my mask off or anything, I was like, I'm going to do a test because I feel a little bit ill. And then I did, and I tested positive then that day. So before the flight, I tested negative, and after the flight, I was positive.
Huh.
Yeah, and I think this is just a mess of the bureaucracy of the system, because I think what they should be doing is they should have lateral flow tests at the boarding gate, and then, before you get on the plane, you take the test, and then fair enough, it would have been a bit crap for me, but then it's like that's how it actually should have been. But instead, it's like, no, you take your test at this like a day before, and then as long as you've got the right paperwork, they let you on and stuff, and it should be that way, but it isn't, which means that I flew back with COVID, not knowing. I thought I hadn't. Like when I sent that message to you and Joe saying, I'm ill with the flu, but it's not COVID. And then I came back and landed and did a test, and it was
narrator.
COVID.
It was COVID. Yeah. Well, I wouldn't want to be the guy sitting next to you on the flight. Well, I guess Spain to UK isn't too far, but
yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I had a good mask on the whole way. There wasn't someone directly next to me, and the when you're in the air is all filtered as well. So hopefully, okay. But yeah, it could be a bit of a. I mean, I didn't know, so it's not like a dick.
Oh, I'm not blaming you. I think that
yeah.
It's not great, and like airports and other places are pretty crowded. So it's a difficult time. The COVID cases are just going absolutely crazy over here, because we've had pretty low cases in Australia because
but now it's there.
lockdown, and then I mean we have high vaccination rates, but it's just last few weeks has been going. We're basically at UK levels of daily cases now, like per person.
Well, I think
which we've never had before. So
what's it called? The Omicron's quite a lot more infectious. But I do think that what we're seeing is basically like evolution in action, right? We're seeing like a strain.
Microevolution. Get your facts right. Well,
microevolution. Not macro. You don't see one kind changing into another. But it clearly is a case of that, where it's like it's just being out competed by another strain. But then you see these, because there's a lot less deaths from Omicron, you see people like James White and saying, masks do nothing, the vaccine does nothing. I'm like, I've been pretty ill with this. I'm really glad that
James White is saying that, is he? Or is he more of a nuthead than I thought he was?
And I'm so glad I had 3 vaccines, because I've been pretty ill with Omicron, which is apparently the mildest strain. And I don't know how ill I would have been without, 3 vaccines.
Why are so many Christian evangelicals clueless about COVID? Like, I don't get it. How does it in any way relate to any of their...
They want it to be... Well, it does relate because, on a naturalist point of view, right, this is just what we expect, because religion is a natural phenomena which has its roots in, all the other forms of human life that there are. And so it's a political thing, right? And so political restrictions, freedom of speech, the culture wars, all that, it's all tied into the government trying to restrict people in certain ways, which is why religion is true. Like this is how the thought pattern works, is, oh, they're trying to restrain you because Jesus is coming soon. Like that's, that's the way they think about these things.
I mean, not to say that there's not this sort of tribalism in irreligious spaces. Of course there is, but
but it's
just, I just think it's
not
pathetic.
that
Like
one.
it's not that one. Yeah, it doesn't relate to a ongoing massive pandemic, and I don't know. It seems to me to be so obviously not connected to any. I mean, it's connected to a culturally bound like set of beliefs and practices, right? But it's not in any way entailed by any of their core commitments in a way that you could argue abortion or something is. Like this just isn't. Like it's why it's so.
But it needs to make it relevant now. Like Jesus is coming soon. These are the what's it, the creaks and groans of creation under sin, waiting for Jesus to return.
It's like if you're, I'm not saying it's all evangelical Christians, of course, but it's certainly greatly disproportionate, and we see a lot of examples of this. And like it's like, well, you shouldn't believe in evolution or climate change or COVID, like
climate
vaccines.
Change
like,
is the crazy one as well. Like we're all screwed. Like we're really screwed, man. That's the real eschaton. That's the real end times.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, someone just commented something in chat that reminds me. So Rebecca has a book that she wants me to read about the origin of life, abiogenesis. It'd be good to do an BA on that at some point. I haven't read the book yet, so that's in.
I agree, but I want to read more. I want to. I mean, maybe you're more comfortable than me, but I want to make sure when we do that I'm putting forward the best case and articulating it well, which means I want to do more reading on the biology of it and the fossil evidence and all that stuff. But also there's a good book by Elliot Sober on why, like, the philosophical implications, so like why evolution is the best explanation of the data and making sense of it. He's got a book on that I'd like to read, I think, before we do anything like that. But
yeah, it just occurred to me it's another topic that we should discuss. I don't hear about it too much in the sort of mainstream apologetic circles, but it's something that comes up periodically.
Yeah, and there's more. I think I see a lot of people being polarized in that direction, at least, because it's like that. Okay, I'm losing belief, so now I need, like, this is where I'm going to put the this is the hill I'm going to die on, sort of thing. This is how I drive a wedge between me and the world. And yeah,
some of this stuff I can't, like some of the philosophy of mind stuff, origin of life being two big examples, maybe resurrection even as another example of this, is just looking for gaps in our current sort of scientific understanding where we particularly don't have as clear idea, and then trying to put, like, the classic God of the gaps, maybe not in a strict logical sense, right? But in a, well, which interestingly wasn't the original usage of God of the gaps, but forget about that. It's the idea that if science can't explain it, then God explains it, which I just do not understand fundamentally.
Well, there's a really funny sketch on this in if you've ever watched Peep Show, and I mentioned this yesterday in a stream actually, but there's Peep Show's really funny, and one of the characters ends up joining a cult, and you hear the characters in a monologue as they go and do these things. So he's sort of like he's talking to his mate, and he's like, oh, there's these cultists on the street who give out personality tests to try and recruit people, and then they're like, oh yeah, we'll go over to them and we'll show them, let's take him for a run around, show him what real psychos are like or something. And then he goes in and talks, and the guy's like, do you ever feel lonely in life? And he's like, he's thinking, like, I know what will fuck with him. I'll say no. And he's like, no. And then he's like, sometimes these problems come from childhood. Is there anything in your childhood? And then he just starts crying and saying, like, well, why did you leave Dad and stuff? And anyway, he joins this cult. He goes back to his flatmate, and he's got, like, all the buttons done up and stuff. And his friend sees the book of the cult that he's in, and goes like, I've heard about these people on the internet. And he's like, yeah, there is a conspiracy theory going around on the internet that they're a cult, but it's all wrong and stuff. And then his friend goes like, oh, well, let's see what's in the book. He reads it, and it's like orgones or something. It's like chapter 9, why orgones are responsible for all the problems in the world. And and the friend who's joined the cult goes, well, how do you explain all the problems in the world? And he's like, well, I'm not sure I could, Jeremy. There's complex historical and political reasons. And he's like, exactly, you can't. And then, it just captures precisely.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Do you have an explanation for all of the problems in the world? Well, no, I guess I don't.
Yeah, orgones. And it's like a classic, it's a good philosophical exercise in what constitutes like a good and bad explanation as well. Like like organomes, like, yeah, just invent something, give it a label, and it just directly explains the phenomena that you want to appeal to. It doesn't enlighten it, it doesn't illuminate it in any way, or give you any deeper understanding that is transferable to anything else. Or, yeah. Okay. So anything else you want to say about in this episode about the future of BA or anything like that?
I think so. I think we covered everything we wanted to. Talked a bit about what I've been doing, what you've been doing. Talked a bit about what we might want to do with BA and the strategy, and then specific topics. Yeah, I think that was what we wanted to do. So it was good. A bit of a catch up. It's been a little while. So yeah.
It is good. Yeah. So I guess we'll see everyone in 1, 2, 3 weeks, that is, for the next episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Let me find where the closing thing is. Yeah, bye everyone. Thanks for watching.